Hello everyone, I'm Chris, and this is everything you need to know before watching Invincible Season 3, releasing on February 6th. If you end up enjoying this video and want to see more from us, then make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to know anytime we upload a new video. In just a couple short weeks, the Invincible animated series will be following up its first two incredible seasons with the premiere of Season 3 on February 6th. So ahead of the new season's release, we'll be taking a look back at the show's previous 16 episodes to help remind you of everything you'll need to know before watching its next 8. To begin, we witness as the White House is suddenly attacked by the Mauler twins, who aren't actually twins but rather an original and a clone of the mad scientist Mauler, who've come to threaten the safety of the president. But their attack is quickly interrupted by the arrival of the Guardians of the Globe, the Immortal, Darkwing, War Woman, Red Rush, Aquarius, Martian Man, and the Green Ghost, along with another superhero who's chosen not to become an official member of the team named Omni-Man. And together, the 8 heroes are able to swiftly take down the Maulers, who are then transported to prison by the Global Defense Agency, a multinational government organization in charge of protecting Earth. We then transition over to the home of the Grayson family to meet a young man named Mark and his mother Debbie, who it turns out are the wife and son of Omni-Man, Nolan Grayson. Mark, despite being the son of a superpowered warrior from the planet Viltrum, currently has no powers of his own, as they've yet to kick in, but that doesn't stop him from trying to be a hero at school after witnessing a kid named Todd harassing a girl named Amber Bennett. But his efforts just result in him being knocked on his ass, with Todd's assault only being stopped thanks to Amber kicking him in the nuts. Following school, Mark then heads over to his job at Burger Mart, where we later see him taking out the trash, and it's here where Mark's powers finally kick in, so he promptly fills his parents in on the news when he gets home, leaving his father frozen for a moment before Nolan then offers to begin his training the following morning. The first thing they decide to work on is Mark's ability to fly, as well as how he can use his flight to his advantage in a fight, with Nolan having Mark repeatedly attempt to hit him before deciding to just show him how it's done and landing a huge strike into Mark's chest, leaving him gasping for air. And Nolan defends his actions by telling Mark he has to be prepared for anything. This leaves Mark pretty upset though, and worried that his father may now believe he's too weak to do what he does. So he later heads off in a homemade superhero costume and attempts to fight crime on his own, soon encountering 3 robbers on the run from the police, including a man capable of encasing his body in rock known as Titan, who after a brief fight, Mark's able to shatter the rock form of and incapacitate. Following his victory, Mark's found by his father, who isn't too happy with the stunt he just pulled. So Mark, still wanting to prove he's strong enough to do this, urges his father to hit him again, but Nolan, realizing he's gone about Mark's training wrong thus far, instead hugs him before taking him to his tailor and close friend, Art Rosenbaum, who's created costumes for many of Earth's heroes. To begin the suit making process, Art usually likes to go off their superhero name, which Mark hasn't picked out yet, but he eventually does decide on one the following day through some words of encouragement from his father during training.
Kids your age think they're invincible, and it holds them back, makes them careless. The thing is, you're different. You actually are invincible.
So Mark, now with his new suit and going by Invincible, once again heads out to fight some crime and encounters another supervillain called Kill Cannon, who he makes quick work of. Meanwhile, we see each of the Guardians of the Globe are suddenly called to meet at their headquarters for a Guardians emergency, but upon their arrival, they quickly realize that none of them had actually signaled the alert, and before they can understand what's going on, they're suddenly attacked by Omni-Man, who shockingly manages to catch Red Rush and crush his head, before then killing each of the other Guardians, despite them putting up a worthy fight that knocks him into a coma. Shortly following the massacre, the 8 superhumans are found by agents of the GDA, led by director Cecil Stedman and his assistant Donald Ferguson, who quickly transports them to the GDA's base, the Pentagon, where they're able to patch up Omni-Man but fail to revive the 7 dead heroes, before then bringing in Debbie and Mark to inform them of what went down, which Cecil doesn't actually know the exact details of yet, since whoever the attacker was left no trace of their identity. Meanwhile, downtown, there's another huge problem that requires the GDA's attention, as an army of interdimensional beings known as Flaxons have just arrived on Earth and have begun killing numerous civilians. So with Earth's strongest team of heroes now dead and Omni-Man incapacitated, Mark decides to try and take on the aliens himself, which proves to be much more traumatic and brutal than he'd expected and leaves him frozen in a state of shock. But fortunately, he's soon joined in battle by another team of heroes known as the Teen Team, featuring Duplicate, Rexplode, Robot, and Adam Eve. Even with their arrival though, the Flaxans still remain in control, and it appears they're actually about to kill the Teen Team until the aliens begin to suddenly age rapidly, which is a result of them coming from a dimension where time moves much faster, so they're forced to exit through their portal in order to avoid dying of old age. The day following the Flaxans' attack, Mark actually runs into Eve, full name Samantha Eve Wilkins, while at school, and after some talking, she invites him to meet with the rest of the team, and during this later meeting, we learn that Eve is actually dating Rex, despite him being a bit of a douche. A few days later, Mark is informed that his father has finally awoken from his coma, and shortly after that, Nolan's permitted to return home. Only a short week after that though, Cecil's already in need of his help once again, as they've discovered that a being Nolan's tangled with before is rapidly approaching Earth, so they need his help to stop it. But Debbie refuses to let him go back to work so soon, and instead, Mark offers to handle the job. So he's sent out into space to fend off the otherworldly being named Alan the Alien, who throughout their brawl communicates with Invincible through telepathy, and eventually pauses their fight upon realizing Mark has no idea who he is or why they're fighting. So Alan sits him down and explains that he's an evaluation officer for the Coalition of Planets, and that his job is to stop by planets and make sure there's someone capable of defending them against planet-conquering monsters. He's only supposed to go to planets that signed up for their program though, and it turns out Earth never did, and he'd just gotten them mixed up with another planet called Urath all this time. So upon realizing this, he heads back to the Coalition of Planets, hoping that he doesn't get fired. Moving ahead to the next day while Mark's at school, as the good news keeps on coming, while he's approached in the halls by Todd, who, having been blackmailed by Amber using some photos of him he'd like to keep hidden, apologizes to Mark and hands him Amber's number. However, things quickly take a turn for the worst when Mark's informed that the Flaxans have returned, and according to Robot, have now rendered themselves immune to Earth's time stream. Fortunately though, as each of them are being pummeled by Flaxans, the battle is flipped completely in Earth's favor thanks to the arrival of Omni-Man, who unleashes a brutal attack on the aliens that sends them running back through their portal. But he doesn't just stop there, as he then follows them back to their dimension to completely decimate every corner of it. Shortly following Nolan's return to Earth, the news of the Guardian's death finally breaks, leading to public and private funeral ceremonies for the heroes. And at the latter, Cecil approaches Robot with an offer to build and lead the new Guardians of the Globe, which he accepts. So Robot calls in a bunch of lesser-known heroes to begin tryouts for the team, which Invincible, although attending, will not be taking part in, since his father wants to train him himself. And when the tryouts are complete, Adam Eve, Rexplode, Duplicate, Shrinking Ray, Monster Girl, who's actually a 24-year-old with powers accompanied by a curse that makes her younger every time she transforms, and a former Guardians member who'd lost his powers some time ago named Black Samson, are chosen to join the new team. Eve immediately resigns though, refusing to be on the same team as Rex and Kate, since a few days ago, she'd actually walked in on them having sex. Moving ahead a bit now to Mark's first hangout with Amber, who he decided to call up previously and ask out on a study date at his home. But just after she gets there, he's suddenly met by Cecil teleporting into his room, as he needs his help in taking down a rogue supervillain named Doc Seismic, who's begun wreaking havoc on Mount Rushmore using earthquake wristbands he'd created. So Mark leaves Amber alone in his room for a while, claiming he has to help his dad's friend with something, to deal with Seismic alongside Eve. And once having done that, he then returns to a disgruntled Amber, with whom he's quickly able to smooth things over, and the two even start making out. Elsewhere, Rex is shown also trying to smooth things over with Eve, but she still decides they should go their separate ways, and actually heads over to Mark's house afterwards, as the two had grown close recently, but she doesn't end up getting the chance to talk to him since he's still busy with Amber. Shifting focus back to the death of the Guardians now, as we see Debbie, while doing some work late at night, being met in her home by the demon detective Damian Darkblood, who we were first introduced to earlier when he arrived at the scene of the Guardian's death to begin looking into the case, as he must seek justice for others in order to save his own soul and avoid returning to hell. And after looking into all the evidence at his disposal, he suggested to Cecil that Omni-Man was behind the murders, but Cecil chose not to believe him and ordered him not to tell anyone else about his theory. Darkblood though has now come to meet with Debbie in hopes that she'll know something about what took place, but their conversation is quickly interrupted by Nolan entering the room, so the demon's forced to exit. Nolan knows he'd been there though, and later confronts Darkblood at his office to suggest that he was the one behind the Guardians' murders, but they both know it was Nolan, and Darkblood claims the truth will come out eventually. When Nolan returns home, he's soon met again by Cecil, who's come to ask if Nolan would be willing to shadow NASA's first manned mission to Mars and make sure nothing goes wrong. But Nolan declines the offer, and it's instead accepted by Mark, So Mark travels to Mars alongside NASA's aircraft and manages to remain hidden the entire trip. But although everything goes smoothly at first, shortly after landing, Mark ends up falling asleep and wakes up to find that the 4 astronauts have gone missing. After following the trail of their footsteps though, he manages to find a trap door leading to tunnels underground, out from which he's suddenly attacked by a sequid that fortunately doesn't do him any harm, before he then stumbles upon a group of Martians who, just like Martian Man, have shape-changing abilities. After seeing a sequid try and fail to attack Invincible, they reveal that the sequids are actually world-destroying parasitic aliens, seeking to take over an appropriate host to become unified and unstoppable. They've been unable to take over any of the Martians though, thanks to their shape-changing abilities, but they could successfully take over a human. So the Martian Emperor orders for the 4 astronauts to be executed. Mark obviously can't let that happen, so he grabs hold of the astronauts and flies them back to their ship, on which they eventually manage to escape. Although not all of them, as one of the astronauts, Russ Livingston, is intercepted during their escape by a Martian, who promptly knocks him out and takes his place on the aircraft, while the real Russ is left to be taken over by the Sequid hive mind. Throughout all this, back on Earth, Nolan and Debbie decide to take a trip together to Italy for the 2 weeks Mark's gone. And while they're gone, Damian Darkblood takes the opportunity to look throughout the house. As he's searching though, he's interrupted by Cecil and multiple GDA agents, who've been put on Darkblood's trail by Nolan, who claims that Darkblood had committed the murders and is also backed up by them having found dried blood of the Guardians at his office. Cecil though is actually aware that Nolan had planted that evidence, but still brings Darkblood to the Pentagon to deal out punishment for him not dropping the case like he told him to, since he needs to keep their knowledge of Nolan's involvement hidden until they can figure out how to stop him. So Cecil lures him into an exorcism and uses the Demonius Ex Mortem to send him back to hell. When Mark returns to Earth following the Mars mission, he begins really struggling to juggle his responsibilities as a superhero and his growing relationship with Amber, with him consistently either missing or showing up late to their plans. So he looks to make it up to her by joining her at the Beckwell Community Center to volunteer. A few days prior to that though, Mark, while flying over the city, has his attention drawn by the previously defeated Titan, who now is hoping to actually gain Invincible's help in taking down his boss, Machine Head, who Titan's been forced to work for as a button man under the threat of his wife and daughter's lives. Mark's hesitant to help him at first, unsure if he's really trustworthy, but after seeing him with his family, he agrees to do it. So prior to Mark's plans at the community center, he and Titan break into Machine Head's penthouse to apprehend him. But it turns out Machine Head had known they were coming, and so hired 5 supervillains, Battle Beast, Kursk, Megamaniac, Tether Tyrant, and Furnace, to thwart their attempt and kill them. And the supervillains quickly gain the upper hand in their brawl, primarily thanks to Battle Beast, who delivers quite the beating to Invincible before being interrupted by the new Guardians of the Globe. Although the Guardians haven't yet figured out how to really work together as a team, so the villains still maintain control despite their arrival, with Battle Beast continuing to beat Invincible to the brink of death, as well as nearly kill Black Samson and Monster Girl. But seeing their teammates severely wounded actually helps the Guardians start fighting as one, and they manage to take out each of the villains outside of Battle Beast, who decides to leave on his own accord, embarrassed by the other supervillains' performances. Machine Head attempts to leave as well, with help from his right-hand man, Isotope, who's capable of teleporting himself and others, but he's currently nowhere to be found. So Rex is able to knock Machine Head out and have him arrested upon the GDA's arrival, who also rush Invincible, Black Samson, and Monster Girl to their hospital in hopes of saving them. Once everyone's exited the building, Isotope then re-enters alongside Titan, who it turns out was just using Invincible so he could take the brunt of Machine Head's attack prior to his arrest. And Titan now looks to take the latter's place as the city's new kingpin. Back at the Pentagon though, the doctors are fortunately able to revive the heroes, with Black Samson, after being defibrillated, shockingly not only regaining a heartbeat, but also his superhuman abilities, and Monster Girl making a full recovery thanks to help from Robot, who appears to have taken a keen interest in her. Mark also eventually returns to 100%, and after convincing Amber his injuries were from being hit by a bus, he looks for them to start things fresh, beginning with taking a trip to Upstate University along with Mark's best friend William, per an invitation from William's crush, Rick. And this seems to work in improving their relationship, with the two even making plans of attending Upstate U together once they finish high school. But soon enough, things take a turn for the worse when a cyborg suddenly comes bursting out of the ground and begins wreaking havoc on the campus, forcing Mark to suit up as Invincible to stop it. The creature ends up taking itself out though, after its helmet gets knocked off and it sees its own face, which prompts it to leap straight onto a pointed statue. Also during the short battle, William managed to deduce that Mark is actually invincible, While on the other hand, Amber grows furious with Mark for seemingly leaving them during the attack, and she refuses to speak to him for the rest of the trip. He isn't able to dwell on that for very long though, as later that night, Rick and William end up getting kidnapped by another cyborg, so he heads out to find them and eventually does within the sewers as William's just about to be operated on by another attendee of Upstate U, genius D.A. Sinclair, who believes he's fixing humanity's weaknesses by transforming them into cyborgs, 3 of which he sends after Invincible, with one of them being Rick. But their attack doesn't go on for too long as William eventually manages to help Rick remember who he is, leading him to join Invincible's side of the fight to rid the other 2 cyborgs of Sinclair's control, before Invincible then breaks Sinclair's jaw and calls in Cecil to lock him up. The following morning, Mark, William, and Amber drive back home, while Amber still refuses to talk to Mark. So to explain why he's been such a bad boyfriend, he finally reveals to her that he's invincible. But it turns out she already knew he was a superhero and is still upset that he makes her feel unimportant, resulting in the 2 breaking up. During Mark's trip to Upstate U, meanwhile, Debbie, while looking throughout her closet, had stumbled upon Damian Darkblood's notepad, which he'd purposely left for her to find before being taken away by Cecil earlier. And within it, she found intriguing notes about Nolan's costume that had been damaged during the Guardians' attack. So she began searching throughout the house for it and eventually found it, still covered in blood. And upon finding it, she then took it to Art Rosenbaum so he could look over it from top to bottom, and his examination proves once and for all that Nolan killed the Guardians. So with it now having been proven to her that Nolan was the one behind the murders all along, she confronts him to try and learn why, and he claims he had no other choice and that she just needs to trust him, but she instead demands he leaves. Immediately following his exit, Donald Ferguson and other GDA agents arrive at the home and hastily take her back to their base, where Cecil explains that he's known Nolan killed the Guardians and has tried and failed to look for a way to defeat him. So he believes now that their only hope at standing a chance against Omni-Man is Invincible. Just in case that doesn't work out either though, Cecil also calls for the Guardians to meet at their headquarters and await further instructions. Since their battle against Machine Head's team of supervillains previously, the Guardians have actually started to get along really well, with Robot and Monster Girl in particular becoming very close. Although it seems Robot has hopes that they can become even closer. It turns out Robot isn't actually just a robot, but rather a drone controlled remotely by a severely deformed scientist named Rudolph Connors, who decided years ago to keep his real identity and appearance hidden by becoming Robot and acting as closely to an actual AI as possible. But now, having met Monster Girl, who like him is also a prisoner in her own body, he's decided to create a new body of his own. In order to do this though, he'd need help from the Maulers, who as we know are experts in tissue growth and DNA replication. So he helps break them out of prison and offers to pay them to build him a new body, to which they agree. For this body, Robot covertly takes a sample of Rex's DNA, since he's noticed that Monster Girl's shown some interest in him. And eventually, his new body is complete, so the Maulers then take Rudy out of his pod and successfully copy his consciousness into his new body. After which, the original Rudy then asks his new self to put him out of his misery, and so he does. With their job complete, and after handing over their payment, Rudy tells the Maulers it's time to go back to prison, which they refuse of course, so Rudy, using a neural link that he had the Maulers install, is forced to unleash a giant robot attack onto them. Although that's quickly interrupted when he's called away to Guardians HQ, where he then introduces himself to the team and explains how he got to this point, freaking pretty much all of them out, especially Rex, but it does seem to have gained Monster Girl's affection. Shifting back to Omni-Man now as he returns home, hoping to be the first to explain all that's happened to Mark, but he's instead met by a bunch of GDA agents who he makes quick work of before noticing Donald and even more GDA agents spying on him across the street. So he enters the building and goes after Donald, forcing the latter to sacrifice himself and set off a bomb in hopes of taking Nolan out of commission for a bit. But the bombing ends up having no effect on him, and he heads off to search for Mark, who's currently busy venting with Eve about everything that went down with Amber, while she also vents about some personal problems of her own. Following her breakup with Rex, Eve had also had a falling out with her parents, with her father claiming that the worst day of his life was when she got her powers. So she decided to leave home and began solely focusing on helping those in need around the world. With Omni-Man fast approaching Mark and Eve, Cecil's next option is to unleash an attack via satellite onto him. But this fails as he just flies straight to the device to destroy it. So he then sends down another attack using 3 cyborgs he had D.A. Sinclair create for him using dead US soldiers called Reanimen. But although they put up a good fight, Nolan again ultimately comes out on top. With neither of those attacks working, Cecil unleashes the final option at his disposal, that being a gigantic kaiju creature Omni-Man had defeated previously, which they've now pumped with every drug, enhancement, and upgrade they have, and have named Hail Mary. And this beast actually holds the control against Nolan. Mark and Eve, though, after hearing the destruction from afar, decide to make their way over and offer help, although Eve soon receives a phone call from Cecil filling her in on everything, and is told to just head over to Guardians HQ, so she does. While Mark's already rushed into battle to help his father, things are soon made even more difficult for Nolan though, as back at the Mauler's base, we see that they've dug up Immortal's body, as they plan on reviving him under their control to get revenge on Rudy. But although they do succeed in reviving him, their mind control doesn't work, and the Immortal instead rushes off to find Omni-Man. And upon finding him, Immortal unleashes a relentless attack, leaving Invincible to fight off Hail Mary alone, but he's fortunately able to take it down using an electric cable, just in time to witness his father murder Immortal once again by slicing him in half. Mark initially thinks someone's controlling Nolan, but it's quickly revealed that's not the case, as Nolan explains the truth about his home planet Viltrum. He reveals that Viltrum have created a perfect civilization through years of removing the weak from their society and cutting their population in half to reach their full potential. And once they had become the greatest empire in the galaxy, they decided to become the only empire in the galaxy. So they traveled and unleashed their power onto thousands of planets until they either accepted their place in the Viltrum Empire or were destroyed. But as their territory grew, their forces were stretched thin, so to more efficiently conquer worlds, each of their most trusted officers were sent to weaken a planet by themselves, and Nolan was sent to Earth, which now that Mark's gotten his powers, it's time to welcome into the Viltrum Empire as well. Mark can't understand how his father could do this to all their friends and family, specifically his mother, but Nolan explains that, although he does love Debbie, she's more like a pet to him, and this statement completely sets Mark off. So with Mark refusing to help conquer Earth, Nolan's forced to unleash a brutal attack onto him, during which he sends him crashing into the city, resulting in a ton of death, and Nolan plans to continue killing people until Mark accepts the inevitable, next slamming him down into the subway and forcing him to watch as he uses his body to kill an entire train of civilians. Even after all this, and a continued vicious assault by his father, Mark still refuses to let him take over his home, so Nolan begins punching him over and over to death, while claiming he can always just start over with another kid. Before he can land the fatal blow though, Nolan's mind flashes back to a memory from when he and Debbie were watching a young Mark play baseball, which Nolan claimed was a waste of time, but Debbie helped him recognize the joy it brought Mark. That's harder to feel as you get older, and the weight of the world bogs you down.
But our children remind us of the joys in life. It brings us back, shows us what life is all about.
And Nolan, after seeing the smile on Mark's face, began cheering him on as well. The memory ultimately makes Nolan unable to actually kill his son, and instead he berates him for fighting a pointless battle, as 500 years from now, everyone and everything he loves or cares about will be gone. But Mark claims he'd at least still have his father, which appears to break Nolan down, and he promptly flies out of Earth. Following his departure, a GDA helicopter arrives to pick up Mark and take him to the Pentagon to be nursed back to health, while the Guardians head off to save as many people as they can from Omni-Man's destruction. Also throughout this, the Maulers are found at their base by GDA agents and are subsequently transported back to prison. Mark spends the next few weeks recovering until he's back to 100% and able to return home, where he's soon met by William, Eve, and Amber, the latter of whom greets him with a kiss, leading to the two getting back together. But the group's conversation is eventually interrupted when Mark receives a call from Cecil informing him that someone's flying towards Earth from deep space. So Mark flies off to face them, and it turns out to be Alan the alien, here to warn Mark that there's a Viltrumite on his planet, which he already knows of course. So he explains to Alan everything that happened with his father, which in turn leads Alan to reveal that the Viltrum Empire had also destroyed his planet, which is why he joined the Coalition of Planets, as they're trying to unite enough worlds to stop the Viltrumites. And so Mark offers to help them however he can. In the weeks following Mark's destructive showdown with his father, he, despite being ordered to take some time off by Cecil, attempts to make up for all the lives that were lost by spending his days fighting crime and helping those in need. But still, he doesn't feel he's doing enough, and so meets with Cecil to try and convince him that he's ready to work for him once again. But Cecil refuses, believing he needs more time to get his head on straight. And for now, he continues to call on the Guardians of the Globe, who are seen battling a giant that appears to have the mental capacity of an 8-year-old. And despite eventually defeating the giant, it comes after a ton of destruction, which Cecil blames on poor leadership from Rudy, who's still adjusting to his new body, and leads him to announce that the team will be given a new leader, the once again revived Immortal, as well as a new member known as Bulletproof, leaving Rudy greatly disappointed in himself. The team still continues to struggle under Immortal's leadership initially though, who's much tougher on them than Rudy. But despite this, they're still able to come out on top of their next battle against the Lizard League, thanks to help from a new hero called the Shapesmith, who's actually just the Martian who'd escaped as Russ Livingston previously, and was promptly welcomed onto the team by Immortal. Shifting focus for a moment now onto the previously once again imprisoned Maulers, as they're each suddenly met in their cells by a pair of portals, and promptly escape through them to be met by a man named Angstrom Levy, who has the ability to open portals between dimensions, although not within the same dimension. The reason he's broken the Maulers out of prison, despite he and them clearly not sharing the same values, is because he needs their help powering a somatic encoder, which reads copies and writes human minds, so that it can transport the memories of hundreds of his variants into his singular mind, with him further explaining that all of their problems, like famine, war, climate change, and cancer, have already been solved somewhere else, and so he wants to absorb all the answers from across the multiverse to potentially save the lives of trillions. Ultimately, he's able to convince the Maulers to help him in exchange for sending them to any reality of their choosing. However, soon the Maulers' whereabouts are discovered by Cecil, who believes the best choice for this mission is Invincible, and so sends him over, with Mark arriving just moments after they'd activated the machine. And after they refuse to shut it down, he promptly enters a battle against the Maulers, which Angstrom attempts to stop by insisting that what they're doing is for the greater good. But Mark struggles to believe him, forcing Angstrom to call on several other Maulers from different realities to subdue him. They don't only look to overpower him though, instead beginning to brutally beat him to death, prompting Levi, not wanting his utopia to be built with blood, to remove the device from his head, in turn causing the machine to explode and seemingly kill everyone in the building, outside of Invincible, who's left once again traumatized by so many people dying as a result of his actions. Sometime later though, it's revealed that not only had Mark survived, but also one of the Maulers, and this universe's Angstrom Levy, who've both been severely disfigured by the explosion. And in Levy's case, that's not only physically, but mentally as well, as he seems to have lost track of which memories are his own and which are his variants, which convince him that Invincible is a monster, and lead him to proclaim that he won't rest until he kills Invincible for all the lives he's taken. Despite the unfortunate result of his previous mission, Mark still continues forward, now once again working under Cecil, and after taking down a few threats, he takes a brief break for his first day of college at Upstate U with Amber and William, the latter of whom he'll be dorming with. Although it isn't long before he heads off to Amber's dorm so the two can have sex for the first time. While they're doing that, let's shift our focus out into space and run through a brief history of the home planet of the aforementioned Alan the Alien, Europa, one of many planets taken over by the Viltrum Empire, which after the Unopans continued to rebel, wiped out just about their entire population, outside of a few who'd managed to escape to various Unopan outposts, where they started breeding camps to rebuild their population. This new generation of Unopans, however, were part of a genetic enhancement program to breed a soldier capable of defeating a Viltrumite in combat, and resulted in Alan's birth, who proved to be their first and only success. Still though, Alan wasn't quite strong enough to battle a Viltrumite, so he was instead given a new purpose after the Unopans were welcomed onto the planet Telescira to join the coalition of planets by its leader Thetis, being made a planetary evaluation officer and sent to discover any being able to defeat him in hopes of finding an ally strong enough to withstand the Viltrumite. And luckily for the coalition, this led him to discovering Invincible. Alan's soon given a new mission though, as after having just recently joined the coalition, the planet Acreon was subsequently attacked by Viltrumites, leading Thetis to believe that there may be a mole amongst them. So he asks that Alan find who this person is, although he doesn't get much of an opportunity to, as while eating dinner with his lover, General Telia, Alan's suddenly attacked by a trio of Viltrumite soldiers, Lucan, Vidor, and Thula, demanding to know where Nolan is and of what took place with him and Mark on Earth. But Alan refuses to tell them anything, and so they viciously beat him to the brink of death, with him only managing to still be alive thanks to a life support machine back in Telescira. However, he's shockingly soon taken off life support by Thetis, although it turns out to have been for a good reason, as Thetis believed Alan's body, when left to fend for itself, would recover stronger than ever. And this gamble actually works. Upon awakening, Alan's then hit with another shocking revelation, that being that Thetis is actually a Viltrumite, the only one to ever rebel against the Empire, before he learned of Invincible, and so he asks that Alan bring Invincible here. Speaking of Mark, not long after returning to his dorm with William, he's then shockingly met by an alien that shares a strong resemblance to a praying mantis named Nualzad from the planet Thraxa, hoping to gain the one they call Invincible's help in saving his planet from meteors that could kill billions. And Mark, although somewhat reluctant, is ultimately convinced by William to go help, despite Cecil ordering him not to. So after 6 Earth days, Mark finally makes it to New Alzat's home planet and is taken to meet their monarch, shockingly revealed to actually be his father, Omni-Man. We learn that after fleeing Earth following his blood-soaked attack against its people, Nolan drifted in space for quite some time and was prepared to end it all by sending himself into a black hole. But just then, he noticed a damaged Thraxan aircraft also falling towards it, and so decided to save those inside and return them to their world, and in return, they made him their monarch. Shortly thereafter, he met and quickly became romantically involved with a Thraxan woman named Andressa, leading to the birth of their son, who by the time he's introduced to Mark is only a few months old but appears much older, as the entire lifespan of a Thraxan is only the length of 1 human year. So their son, while still aging slower than the Thraxans, ages much faster than Mark. The reason Nolan's called on Mark though is because the Thraxans and his brother are actually in danger, as soon the Viltrumites will learn that Nolan had abandoned his mission on Earth and track him down, which could result in the deaths of everyone on this planet. So he needs Mark's help in protecting them. Mark's understandably furious upon learning all of this, shocked that his father was able to move on from his life on Earth so quickly, and that now, after everything he did, he just expects him to help clean up his mess. But unfortunately, there isn't much time to argue, as the trio of Viltrumites who'd previously attacked Alan arrive on the planet as well. So while Nolan attempts to hold them off, Mark's directed to the caves of Roclane by Andressa. They're soon followed into the caverns though by Lucan, who immediately overpowers Mark, before then being intercepted by Nolan, who after a short scuffle manages to incapacitate Lucan by slicing open his stomach. With Andressa and their child safe, Nolan and Mark return to the city and discover that many of the Thraxans have been killed, greatly upsetting Nolan, who then suddenly grabs Mark by the throat, questioning why he's so hurt by the deaths of these insignificant, weak creatures, and Mark claims that this is how he should have felt on Earth. The two are then met by the remaining 2 Viltrumites, forcing Nolan into a battle against Vidor, while Mark's left to battle Thula, who he struggles mightily against, forcing Nolan to intervene several times while emphasizing that if he's going to defeat her, he'll need to fight to kill. So Mark does just that, and eventually gains the perfect opportunity to kill her, but he again hesitates, allowing her to stab him in the abdomen. But fortunately, Nolan, having killed Vidor, is able to quickly fly in and kill her as well, only to then be suddenly attacked himself by a returning Lucan, still just barely alive, and he leaves Nolan immobilized before finally succumbing to his wounds. Arriving shortly thereafter is a Viltrumite aircraft to take Nolan away for his execution. And as he's being escorted, Nolan urges Mark to read his books, before Mark's then met by the Viltrum Empire's second-in-command, General Krieg, who informs him that Mark will be assuming his father's mission to prepare his planet for their rule, and that if he refuses, they will kill millions of his people. Following Krieg's exit, Mark's fortunately found by the surviving Thraxans, and eventually nursed back to health, and Mark, filled with guilt over all the lives lost because of he and his father ever stepping foot on this planet, spends the next 2 months helping the Thraxans rebuild their city until they're able to build him a new ship to return home. Ahead of his departure, Mark's met by a now much older Andressa, who asks that he take his younger brother with him back to Earth, since soon, no one else in his family will be left to raise him, and Mark agrees to do so. Upon returning to Earth, Mark first returns home to reunite with his mother, as well as introduce her to his brother and tell her of all that happened, which understandably frustrates her. But despite that, she accepts the child into her life for the time being. And since he hadn't yet been named on Thraxa, Debbie decides to name him Oliver after her own father. She isn't quite able to focus all of her time on raising him though, so she interviews some babysitters and eventually lands on April Hausman, who she was initially against hiring since April had been sent by Cecil. But April emphasizes that Debbie would be her boss, not him. After checking in with his mom, Mark returns to college to see Amber, although he's immediately intercepted by Cecil, furious that Mark went against his orders and is still yet to check in with him. And Cecil, having learned of his brother's arrival on Earth from the GDA's surveillance of Debbie's home, plans on taking him in to run some tests, but Mark refuses to let that happen, so Cecil's forced to step down. During Mark's time in space, Cecil was left to once again solely call on the Guardians whenever a threat appeared, who've been able to mostly adjust to Immortal's leadership, as well as form some notable intimate relationships. In particular, the Immortal and Duplicate have become romantically involved, in large part due to their shared understanding of repeatedly being killed, while Rudy and Amanda also go out on their first date. Now though, Cecil calls for all hands on deck as they've discovered that a spacecraft from Mars is fast approaching Earth. And so he confronts the Shapesmith, who they were able to deduce was a Martian, and forces him to reveal the truth of how he got to Earth, through which they learn of the possible Sequid takeover of Mars. While frustrated with his incredibly stupid actions, they still have him join them for their mission, since he's the only one with insider knowledge of the Martian spacecraft, along with Immortal, Bulletproof, Black Samson, Monster Girl, Robot, and Invincible, since the Sequids won't be able to possess any of them, outside of Robot, who'll be joining them to offer his scientific expertise. In addition, Rex also suggests they seek help from Adam Eve, who, since leaving home some time ago, did her best to use her powers to help those in need, but was still somewhat overwhelmed by her and her parents falling out, causing her to act without considering the potential consequences, which nearly resulted in many innocent people getting hurt, and so she decided to cut her losses and return home, where she's now met by Rex, who actually does a great job of talking her through her recent failures, and convinces her to join the Guardians on their mission to Mars. Thanks to Eve's abilities, the heroes are able to breach the Martian aircraft, and almost immediately, they encounter the real and possessed Russ Livingston and an army of Sequids, which launch an attack against them that is momentarily halted by Robot disrupting their nervous systems with a high-pitched pulse, although it doesn't keep them immobilized for long, so he has the team keep the Sequids distracted while he uses his suit to build an amplifier for the pulse, which once complete, works in incapacitating the Sequids and frees Russ from their control, with whom they hop on their ship and begin their journey back to Earth. Unfortunately, while most of the team was out in space, Rex, Ray, and Kate were forced to go off on a mission of their own to apprehend the Lizard League, as King Lizard, along with Iguana, Salamander, and Komodo Dragon, had unleashed an attack on and taken over a nuclear weapons facility. Much to all the three of the heroes' confusion though, the supervillains prove themselves to be much stronger than they're used to, with Komodo managing to kill every clone Kate throws at him, before grabbing hold of her final two clones, and shockingly smashing them into one another and to their deaths. So in retaliation, Shrinking Ray enters the skull of and kills Salamander. But when she attempts to do the same to Komodo, he instead snatches her out of the air and eats her, which she then attempts to combat by growing back to her normal size, which he's unable to break through and appears to be crushed to death as well, putting Rex in a state of shock as he continues his battle with Iguana, who he eventually manages to kill with a blasted charge, before then just barely managing to kill Komodo, although not without the cost of his own hand, as Komodo bites it off along with another charge, resulting in his head exploding. There's still one villain remaining, however, with that being King Lizard, who fires a gun at Rex's head to seemingly kill him. However, as he then begins reading off his list of demands over the phone, Rex somehow regains consciousness and promptly unleashes a brutal and fatal attack against King Lizard, before falling unconscious once again to be found by GDA soldiers, along with the still alive Ray, who manages to crawl her way out of Komodo's corpse, but is still severely injured. It seems though that Duplicate has truly passed, and her death proves to be very difficult for the Immortal, who claims that despite having suffered many losses in his lifetime, hers has broken him up the most, and leads him to indefinitely step away from the Guardians, leaving Cecil to give his position back to Rudy. And unfortunately, everything the team is going through right now appears to have possibly been for nothing, as back at the home of the real Russ Livingston, he's seen throwing up a Sequid, which promptly possesses him once again. Mark, meanwhile, after returning home from space yet again, goes to finally spend some time with Amber after repeatedly being pulled away from her for one mission after another. But it seems their time apart from one another has created a sort of barrier between them that they're both struggling to break through, leading them to each seek guidance from those close to them, with Amber talking things through with Eve, now living on her own again, and Mark going to see Art Rosenbaum. In addition to their conversation about Amber, Mark also brings up what his father had said about reading his books before he was taken away by General Krieg. And luckily for him, Art happens to have a bunch of them, as Nolan had written sci-fi novels to make money during his time on Earth. So Mark takes them back to his college dorm and reads through a few titled The Man with the Invisible Gun and Savage Planet, Savage Beasts, both of which appear to actually be based on stories Nolan had heard or lived through prior to his time on Earth. Sometime later that evening, Mark is tracked down on Earth by Alan the Alien, here to bring Mark back with him to Telescira per his boss Thetis' orders, who he informs Mark is also a Viltrumite who rebelled against the Empire. Mark, though, refuses to go to space again after having just returned from several trips, needing a chance to actually spend time with his girlfriend. And so he instead shows him his father's books, the stories of which Alan claims to have heard before, in which Mark believes could reveal ways they could hurt a Viltrumite. So Alan leaves to present this information to Thanos. Now let's turn our focus for a moment onto the seemingly revived Donald we briefly mentioned earlier, and who we soon learned had no knowledge of his death at the hands of Omni-Man. At least that wasn't until he ran into Debbie, who was noticeably shocked to see him. And so he visited her home to understand why, but she wasn't there, leading him to instead discover a pair of his glasses amongst the wreckage of the GDA surveillance home destroyed as a result of his sacrifice. So he then decided to take a look at the footage from that day and finally learned of his death. And after cutting open his own arm, he also discovers that he's been completely rebuilt, which he immediately confronts Cecil about, and Cecil reveals that this actually isn't the first time they've resurrected him, presenting him with the footage from the 38 other times where he'd sacrificed himself for the greater good, before he was then rebuilt. And it turns out Donald was the one who'd chosen to have his memory erased, not believing he could handle all of that trauma. And all of this prompts Donald to once again request they do so. Donald isn't the only one the GDA's rebuilt though, as around the same time, they release William's boyfriend Rick, now back at 100% after what DA Sinclair did to him, and he's reunited with William by Donald. Rick, though, is left feeling that pieces of him are missing, and questions who or what he really is, eventually leading him to the roof of his and William's college, prepared to take his own life. So William calls up Donald for help, and upon arriving, Donald reveals to understand how Rick is feeling, since he's now about 98% machine himself, and while he struggled to live with this fact, he's now starting to realize that every time he died, it was cause he helped make the world a little better, just like Rick did when he fought back against Sinclair, and that they aren't just their bodies, but the decisions they make, the lives they change, and the people they love. And his words convince Rick to come off the ledge, as well as convince him not to have his memory wiped after all. On to another hero who's lived through many self-sacrifices himself, as we see the Immortal returning home, only to be shockingly met by a still-alive Kate, who apologizes for faking her own death, but explains that she'd just grown tired of repeatedly dying, and so wanted to give up being a superhero to become someone else. However, she found herself unable to move on with her life due to her feelings for him, and so has returned so they can be together. Back to Mark now, as he and Amber prepare for their first night alone in some time, and it looks like this could be their first of many going forward, since Mark was able to convince Cecil to guarantee him 2 nights off a week, and the two quickly take advantage of this opportunity, flying all across the state before making a stop for dinner. However, their date is sadly once again interrupted, this time by the sudden arrival of a Viltrumite soldier named Anissa, who threatens to kill Amber along with everyone around them if Mark doesn't come with her, claiming she only wants to talk. And so Mark suits up and meets her in the sky. Anissa explains that her people have concluded from their studies of Earth that human civilization has less than an 18% chance of surviving the next 2 centuries without the loss of billions, due to the powerful of this world destroying their own home by stripping resources for themselves. And so she urges Mark to accept his father's mission and welcome Earth into the Viltrum Empire, believing it's the only way to ensure humanity's survival. Mark, though, questions why, if they really care about human lives, are they so willing to kill millions themselves to force them into their empire. And she claims that, while some of them do take pleasure in killing, they do not kill for pleasure, as dead humans don't benefit them in any way. Frustratingly, during Mark's encounter with Anissa, back at the GDA, Cecil's informed of a behemoth-class kaiju in the South Pacific closing fast on a passenger cruise liner. So Mark asks that Anissa, since she claims to want to save human lives, allow him to go stop the beast, and she actually decides to join him in doing so, quickly and suddenly flying clean through the kaiju's neck to kill it. Although thankful for her help, Mark still refuses to allow Earth to join the Viltrum Empire, prompting her to then unleash a sudden and brutal attack against him, barely allowing Mark to land a single blow, before sending him crashing to the ground and threatening to suffocate him to death if he doesn't accept his mission. But still, Mark refuses, so she's forced to remove her foot from his neck, since killing him isn't her task. However, she informs him that soon another will come, and if he finds Mark still resistant of his destiny, then he and the whole planet will pay the price. Anissa then returns to what's revealed to be a Viltrumite prison, although not long after returning, she quickly encounters Alan on his way back to Telescura, and promptly unleashes an attack against him. However, it doesn't have nearly as much of an effect on him as it would have previously, allowing him to land a huge strike of his own that immediately busts her open. Alan, though, is then rather quickly incapacitated by Anissa, or so it appears, as we soon see that he's actually pretending to have been knocked out in order to break into the Viltrumite prison. Mark, meanwhile, having fortunately survived his earlier battle, rushes back to Amber's college dorm, and after all that's happened, Amber's left questioning if they can make this work, tearfully telling him that, although she really wants to, she doesn't think she can live in his world anymore, and so the two are forced to break up. Shortly thereafter, Mark's rough night is made even worse when he receives a phone call from his mother, as revealed to be on the other end is actually Angstrom Levy, with Debbie and Oliver held captive. So Mark rushes home and soon recognizes him from the machine's destruction some time ago that caused his disfigurement, which Levy still blames on Mark, and so he now looks to make him suffer by threatening both his and his family's lives, prompting Mark to rush towards him. But this just allows Angstrom to send him through a portal to another universe, in which Earth is occupied by talking dinosaurs, before he's then transported back home just as suddenly, while Angstrom expresses interest in Oliver, since he apparently hasn't yet encountered him before throughout the multiverse. Mark then again attempts to attack Levy, but is sent through yet another portal, this time right in the middle of a battle between Prof Ock and Agent Spider, seemingly variants of Marvel's Spider-Man and Doc Ock. Soon enough though, Mark is sent back home again, this time to find Levy threatening to drop his family in a dimension where the ground is 8 stories lower. But Mark doesn't believe Levy will actually commit such a dastardly act, since when they first encountered each other, Angstrom had sacrificed himself for Mark, which Levy refuses to believe, claiming he would never save him after all the suffering he caused, before angrily sending him through another series of portals to several different dimensions, including a DC-adjacent universe where he encounters Batman. Levy, meanwhile, continues to struggle to understand why he would ever help Invincible, causing him to begin reliving the memories of his many variants now stored in his one mind, each of which see Invincible mercilessly killing innocent people, including some of Levy's loved ones, before he's then suddenly attacked from behind by Debbie, smashing a vase over his head and slashing him across the chest with a shard. But she's quickly stopped in her tracks as she attempts to escape by Angstrom smashing her through a table before brutally breaking her arm. And now, even more furious, he proclaims that he not only plans on making Mark hurt, but her and Oliver too. He then finally returns Mark back to this dimension. However, this time, Mark manages to get the jump on him, and after seeing what he'd done to his mother, Mark sends him flying out of their home and unleashes a brutal attack against him. Although much to Mark's surprise, Angstrom soon manages to overpower him, revealing that he'd had his body enhanced by the greatest doctors across the multiverse, and had only been sending Mark through dimensions to soften him up so that he could kill him himself. He then sends Mark crashing through dimensions yet again, although this time whilst unleashing an attack of his own against him, and he claims he won't stop until he and his family are dead, a threat that appears to unlock something in Mark, who manages to regain the upper hand and unleashes every bit of strength and anger built up inside him onto Levy, while proclaiming he'll never let anyone hurt his family again, and his attack ultimately ends with him losing control and beating Angstrom to death. With Angstrom dead though, Mark's left with seemingly no way back home. That is until he's met by the future selves of the Guardians of the Globe, including Adam Eve, Robot, revealed to now be Rex instead of Rudy, Bulletproof, Monster Girl, and 2 heroes we haven't yet met, arriving through a time machine, who reveal that, in their world, Mark never returned home, and the world suffered as a result. So they spent the last 20 years searching for his location and building a time machine in hopes of bringing him back to his world and preventing their future from unfolding. So they open up a portal for Mark to return home through. However, before he exits, Eve stops him to confess her love for him, revealing she loved him for a very long time, and asks that he tell her past self how he feels about her so she can move on with her life, leaving Mark shocked as he returns to his dimension. Upon returning, he's immediately able to contact Cecil, who takes him to see his mother, and Mark, after revealing to her what he'd done, becomes quickly overwhelmed with emotion and tearfully falls into her arms. Sometime later, after Debbie's permitted to return home and their house has been rebuilt, Mark informs her that he won't be returning to college, deciding to instead focus on learning to control himself so that what happened with Angstrom Levy doesn't happen again. Also that same night, Mark finally reunites with Eve, who gives him a shoulder to cry on and helps comfort him. But while it seems the reason he'd come to see her was to address what her future self had told him, he's unable to do so just yet. Meanwhile, back in the Viltrumite prison, we see as Nolan is being prepared for his execution with a beating from General Creed, after which he happens to encounter Alan as the two are being taken to their respective cells, and the two, thanks to Alan's ability to communicate telepathically, are able to speak to one another, with Alan revealing he'd actually come here for Nolan, in hopes he would join the Coalition's cause, but Nolan claims he's accepted his fate, believing he deserves death for all that he's done, and no longer considering himself a Viltrumite. However, it seems his mind is then suddenly changed by his desire to see his wife again. And that was everything you needed to know before watching Invincible Season 3. If you enjoyed the video or found it helpful in any way, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. But once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.